Hi, and welcome back to our story hour, and we're still continuing with Singer on the Sand by Norma Youngberg, and we're on chapter 8. Last week we learned how Hans had taught Satu to pray and to talk to God. You know, it's very important that we learn how to talk to God, and we can talk to Him just like you do your mom and your dad or your best friend. And we ended with Marta missing. And so our chapter 8 begins with Islam's victory. Satu stood beside his friend Hans, but fear paralyzed him and he could not take his eyes from the witch doctor, who clutched the big teacher's arm and moaned as though someone had struck him with a spear. As you remember last week when Tama, the witch doctor, found Marta holding his snake, he was so afraid. And then Marta comes up missing, and Tama thinks something has happened to her, and so he's so afraid that the curse of the snake is fulfilling its curse, and so he's so afraid that he can't even speak. The teacher patted Tama's shoulder and tried to soothe him enough so he could talk. All the people had run out of their huts and stood watching and listening. They could all understand what the red-haired man was trying to say. He kept asking Tama, "Where is Marta? Do you know where Marta is?" Tama shook his head. It seemed to Satu that all Tama could do now was to shake his head over and over, but at last he spoke in a croaked voice. "I didn't see her. I didn't see her. It's the curse, the snake curse." The big teacher didn't understand at first. He still patted Tama's shoulder and tried to figure out what the witchman had said. But the man's voice was so strangled and full of quivers that even Satu could scarcely make out the words. Finally, Satu went to the teacher. He stood right in front of him and told him what Tama had said. He sounded every word by itself so the red-haired man could understand. "He says he doesn't know where Marta is, but he thinks something bad has happened to her because of the snake curse." A smile spread over the big teacher's face. "What's this snake curse he talks about?" "It must be some curse he has laid against your family," Satu said. "He has powerful spirit charms, you know. He has teeth and skulls of animals and roots and seeds, but his strongest charm is a dried snake." "Oh, that must be what Marta told us about when she went to Tama's house the other day," Hans said. "She said she blessed the poor snake, remember?" Satu shivered. She must have picked up the snake. Tama had already laid the curse on it, I suppose. "This is dangerous, you know." He took hold of Hans and shook him a little. "Something bad has surely happened to Marta. Tama's curses always work." Satu looked at Tama. He thought he had never seen anyone's face so miserable. Everyone stood there looking at the witchman. The teacher looked at him too, but he still kept his hand on Tama's shoulder. "Look here, my friend," the big teacher said. "We don't know where Marta is, but I'm sure she is all right. She must have wandered off somewhere. Now all you people stand right here where you are. I will ask the God we worship to show you that the snake curse cannot touch those who worship him." Then the red-haired man lifted his eyes and talked to the sky. The words he said were loud and powerful, and the people trembled, although they couldn't understand. When the words were finished, the big teacher smiled and said to Tama, "Now, help us. We must find the child. She cannot have gone far. She has only been gone since we ate breakfast this morning." It was Tama who found Marta, and Satu was right behind him. They had pushed into the jungle past the spring, and there they found the little girl with a bunch of wildflowers in her hand. She had stripped them from the jungle vine. When Tama came toward her, she held both arms out to him and tried to give him the bouquet of blossoms. The witch doctor lifted her in his arms and held her close. Satu walked behind them and saw the shaking of Tama's shoulders and knew that the witchman tried to put down his great joy at finding little Marta unhurt. At the spring they met the whole village, for everyone seemed to have the same idea. that Marta must have gone into the jungle. Tama put the child in her father's arms and turned to go back to his hut. The teacher took hold of his arm. Tama, you see the child is unhurt. You are not to grieve or worry any more. No spirit curses can hurt this little girl. Satu and Hans stood close to the big teacher. They watched Tama go back to his hut. You see, the big man said, he loves little Marta. He is afraid of his own witch medicine. He looked down at the two boys. God is pulling on Tama's heart, you see. It was evening of the next day when someone saw the chief's fishing boat. It was still only a speck on the horizon, but excitement ran through the village like a flame, and all the people flocked to the landing place and waited for the boat to pull into the wharf. Hans was there with Satu, and both boys strained for the first view of the teachers of Islam. There were 3 of them, smiling brown men with faces much like the people of Great Sangir. 2 of them were young, but one, Satu must be sure that he was the leader because he was older. He wore a red cap on his head, and Satu thought his eyes looked cold, like polished pebbles in the water. All the men acted friendly to everyone, and when the chief led them to his own house, the whole village followed and watched to see what the newcomers would do and say. For one thing, Satu knew already that these men spoke the language of his people easily. He had heard their voices. He also heard the name of the short, stocky man who was their leader. He was called Guru Mullah. The following morning, Chief Meriden sent a messenger to every house in the village, telling them that now he would make a great feast because the new teachers had come. It would be a feast of welcome, and the people must all cook and bring their best palm wine and make merry in order to show the new teachers honor and kindness, because these men had brought wonderful new magic from the southern islands. The feast was set for the 4th day from then. Immediately the whole village seized with excitement. In every house the women began preparation for the feast. Tama came out of his house and mingled with the village people and acted like his old self again. Only in the house on the sand was there no change and no excitement. There was only the beautiful singing at morning and evening, and a great deal of looking into the black book, and still more of talking to the God of heaven. Satu had learned at last that when the big teacher lifted his eyes to the sky or to the roof of the house, he was talking to God, who lived far beyond all things that men can see, up behind the stars. Another thing that Satu had learned was that when the teacher opened the holy book and laid it on his knees, he was not talking to the book of magic. He was reading from it words that had been written there long ago, so long ago that no living man could remember back that far. The evening after the feast was announced, only a few people came to the house on the sand to hear the singing and the words of God. Satu came, and a few others, but the rest of the village people were so eager to prepare for the great feast that they had no time for singing or listening. They were so busy that most of them had no time or thought for the fire mountain. The day after the Islam teachers came, Satu went alone to his perch, high among the rocks. He sat there for a long time, trying to collect his thoughts and to understand what was happening around him in the village. One thing he knew for certain: the battle between the magic of the big teacher and the new teaching of Islam had already begun, and that his father, Chief Meriden, was on the side of the Islam teachers. As he sat there and wondered what might happen next, he could not help seeing that now the fire mountain seemed to throw out more fire than it had ever had before, and the trembling of the ground was more than usual, and even the sound of the deep growlings and thunderings in the solid earth rumbled louder than Satu remembered. If the fire spirits had been angry before, now they raged with fury. The feast was to last 3 days, and most of those 3 days Satu ran back and forth between the village and the house on the sand. In the village all was wild excitement. The people danced and chanted and fought and drank and gorged on the food the women had prepared. In the teacher's house, all was quiet, except for the singing. The big teacher sang all the time these days, and Satu couldn't understand why. Surely he must have seen what the chief had done. He couldn't help knowing about the fine piece of garden land the chief had given the new teachers. And Satu was sure he felt sorry because the village people did not come as they used to listen and learn the words of the songs and the words from the holy book. Now they were busy feasting. Had they forgotten so soon? Yet Satu thought the melodies had never sounded so sweet, and it was a pity, too, because there was so few to listen. During the days of the feast, the big teacher went out to fish, and Satu could hear him singing even out on the water. "Why does your father sing?" Satu asked Hans on the last day of the feast. "There is no one to hear." Hans looked at him surprised. "My father doesn't sing to people. He sings to God." "Why?" was Satu's turn to be astonished. "Well, it's like this. He knows how good and great and strong God is and all the wonderful things God will do. So he sings to thank God for all these things." "And do you think God listens?" "Of course he listens. It makes him glad to hear my father sing. Wait, you will see what God will do." After the feast, some of the people were sick. It was a common thing after these feasts for people to become sick. Satu didn't know why, but Hans said it might be because they ate too much or drank too much palm wine, and maybe the food wasn't clean. Satu wondered about this. He had always thought that evil spirits make people sick, and he could never figure out why, just after a big feast, when the people had sacrificed to the spirits and praised and honored them, the ungrateful spirits should turn right around and make so many people sick. Perhaps Hans was right. Satu began to wonder whether the evil spirits were as powerful as he had thought. Whatever stomach aches the people of Sangir had, they did not trouble the big teacher with them. They flocked to Tama for his witch medicine. The next few weeks there was great activity on the hill back of the teacher's house of the village, for the village men were putting up a fine house for the Islam teachers. They brought poles and timbers from the jungle, and the women wove matting and thatch as the chief's command. They did not stop with building one house, they built 3, and all of them were bigger and better than the teacher's house on the sand. But none of them were so neat, and none of them had a garden of bright flowers hugging its walls. None of them had a little girl like Marta, or a boy like Hans. So Satu chose to go more and more to the teacher's house. It was harder for him to go now, because his father scolded him and threatened to punish him, but still he went. The leader of the Islam teachers, Guru Mullah, persuaded the chief to build a house for worship. Only the men could go to the worship house. No women were allowed. The whole thing was mysterious to Satu, and there was no singing. He could not understand why his father should be so strong for this kind of magic. However, just as Gola had said, there were many of the village people who listened to the new magic. Also, there were some who came back to the teacher's house to worship after the first excitement had passed. By the time the rainy season began, the village had divided into 2 parts. The greater part of the people followed the new teaching of Islam, and a smaller group, about 30 persons, chose to follow the big teacher. Among these was Satu. Even though his father often slapped him and Guru Mullah scolded and they urged him to attend the Islam worship, the boy steadfastly refused. And now the ties of faith and friendship drew him even closer to the teacher's family than before. This was true of all the little flock of village people who worshipped in the house on the sand. It was as though a great hand enfolded them and squeezed them together until they were as one heart and one mind. Now their minds opened to the teaching, and they quickly learned the songs. Little by little they began to look different from the other people of the village. Their faces shone with a kind of brightness. Their bodies were cleaner and stronger. Their huts were neater, and most different of all, they went about their work singing the songs the big teacher had taught them. They understood now that God rejoiced to hear their songs, because when he listened to their sweet songs of praise, he knew that they trusted him for everything. I suppose the Islam teachers are quite happy now, Hans said as he loitered with Satu on the beach. Oh, I wouldn't say that, Satu answered. Gola is grinning all the time. Maybe he is happy. My father, the chief, is unhappy because the big teacher is not going to leave Great Sangir, and of course he is angry with the people who keep on worshiping here in your house. Tama is always sad. I never see him so sour-faced. Do you remember what my father said about Tama the day Marta was lost? Hans asked his friend. Do you remember how he said that God is pulling on Tama's heart? Why would that make Tama so miserable? If something is pulling on you and you resist it and fight with it, you might not be happy either. You might even hurt. Yes, I suppose so, Satu agreed. Another thing, Tama promised the people that if they accepted the Islam teachers, the fire spirits would be comforted and they would lie down and rest and not make all that noise and fire and shaking. Both boys looked at the volcano. It looks to me as if that fire mountain is spouting out more flame than ever, Hans said. Yes, no one has seen any birds over there since the Islam teachers came. Everyone is worried. Now they say that the only way to quiet the spirits is to chase your family away. Of course you know it isn't the spirits that make the fire, Hans said. There are volcanoes in other lands. My father says there are fires deep in the earth. My father has called a council for this evening, Satu said, and they will decide what to do. They are so worried about the fire mountain, they will surely do something. Satu laid his hands on Hans' arms. Whatever I hear, I will tell you. Don't worry. I know that God is strong, and he will take care of us. You know, it sounds like Satu is beginning to understand and to trust in God. It's very important that we tell others about God. And Hans is right. God does like to hear us singing. And when he hears our prayers go up to him, and he hears those too, right along with our singing. So when you say your prayers tonight, make sure you also pray for the missionaries too. And that ends our story of Singer on the Sand for chapter 8. And next week we have a witch doctor struggle. So we find out more of how God is pulling on Tama's heart. So thank you for listening, and good night.